The extreme left haven't stopped at the removal of Confederate statues. They've now moved on to U.S. presidents, such as Washington, Jefferson, Grant, and Roosevelt, leading many to wonder, is this really about the removal of statues put up during the Jim Crow era to intimidate people of color? Or is this about hatred for America, which is what right wingers have been claiming all along? The protesters are saying they just want us to confront our racist legacy. But bearing responsibility for the sins of our fathers is highly problematic and is, quite frankly, against everything liberals should be standing for. Let's go ahead and dive in. But first, if you're new to this channel, welcome and please subscribe. This is a place where you'll get a more logical left perspective. So let's go ahead and look at this article that was written in the Independent. I think it kind of summarizes what happened over the weekend and what's been happening over the past few weeks pretty well. Here it says, over the weekend, Black Lives Matter's protesters continue to deface and tear down memorials to those associated with slavery and racism. In San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, protesters toppled a statue of Francis Scott Key, the composer of the national anthem and a slave owner, as well as a statue of Spanish missionary Junipero Serra, a Roman Catholic priest who forcibly converted and brutalized Native American people. Most controversially, protesters also pulled down a statue of Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general responsible for the defeat of the Confederacy because he owned a slave. As Adam Sewer of The Atlantic points out, Grant was in many ways a fierce and committed anti-racist. As a general, he fought the Confederacy with energy and brutal commitment. He notably insisted that the Confederacy treat imprisoned black soldiers the same as white ones. To Robert E. Lee's consternation, as president, Grant broke the KKK and fought for black voting rights with a tenacity few other presidents have rivaled. But Grant's legacy also has less admirable aspects. Grant's wife had legal ownership of several black people when he married her, and he himself kept a person in slavery for a year before freeing him at the start of the Civil War. As president, Grant's policy towards Native American people could easily be described as cultural genocide. He instigated an illegal and bloody war against the Lakota people of the Black Hills and used federal force to push Native people onto reservations and to slaughter the buffalo they relied on for food. Quote, American Indians experienced some of the worst massacres and grossest injustices in history while Ulysses S. Grant was in office. Alyssa Landry writes at Indian Country Today. Goes on to say, George Washington established American independence and democratic institutions, but he also owned enslaved people and called for genocide against Native Americans. Franklin Roosevelt created America's social safety net and led the country to victory over the Nazis, but he also interned Japanese Americans in concentration camps. Gandhi's nonviolent protest helped to free India from colonial rule and inspired resistance movements worldwide, but his early writings are racist, and in his late 70s, he slept with his teenage grandniece. So, okay, obviously, everybody is problematic because everybody is human. So anybody you look at through a historical lens, you're going to find merits and you're going to find things that you're really not going to like. And that is for anybody. So there's a lot of questions I think a lot of us have when it comes down to the tearing down of these statues. Now, I was on board with it when the protesters said, we've got to take down all of these Confederate statues. And the reasoning was, well, because these Confederate statues were put up during the Jim Crow era. They weren't put up during, or right after the Civil War for the South to honor their generals that, led them to a failed battle. That's not when these statues were put up. They were put up during Jim Crow era in order to intimidate people of color. So therefore, they need to come down. They belong in a museum. I was on board with that. I could say, okay, for sure, if they were put up later on in history, I think it's good to take them down or at least add to the statues with other statues that create more context for what that statue is, kind of like an outdoor or walking museum sort of thing where there's the statue and then there's other, elements to kind of say to people, hey, we're not really idolizing this person because but this is just a person to remind us of our history. And I think it's important to also remember that statues aren't always about glorifying. They're not always about, oh, well, we want to prop this person up as somebody wonderful, and that's why we have the statue. Sometimes statues are just for history's sake. They're just to remember what happened, to ponder. We have plenty of memorials in this country that you could say look kind of like statues, but they're meant to be, where you stop, you pause, you think, you reflect on what happened, lives that were lost, terrible things, atrocities. So, not all statues are necessarily just to glorify an event or to glorify a person. Certainly not the 9/11 statues. I mean, the 9/11 memorial, certainly not the Oklahoma City bombing memorial. Those are out there for people to pause, stop, think, and ponder. So, um, when this then began morphing, and now all of a sudden, it's not just about taking down the Confederate generals, which, look, I can be for the taking down of Confederate generals, one, because of what we just mentioned about the Jim Crow era and to intimidate people of color, but also because the Confederacy kind of, actually was an act of treason against the country. It was the South trying to secede from the United States. It was they waged war against their own nation and lost. And so it's kind of fundamentally anti-American to prop up the Confederate flag or to prop up these Confederate statues. Now you might say, yeah, but that's the South's history. It's deep embedded in the culture. Yeah, but it's still treason at the end of the day. I mean, look, you don't even have to think about the slavery aspect of the Confederacy. You don't even have to get into the emotional side of it. You could actually just eliminate all of that and still say, yeah, but it was still an uprising against the government. It was still a failed attempt at basically at treason. It was an act of war against the nation. So probably just from that perspective, saying that you're proud to be an American and at the same time wave the Confederate flag, or saying that you're proud to be an American at the same time prop up these Confederate generals, doesn't really go together logically at all. So I can get on board with the removal of the Confederate statues. But the rest of these, once you start toppling George Washington because you find out he had a flawed past, like most people during that era, or when you're looking at Thomas Jefferson or Ulysses S. Grant, for goodness sakes, he was a good guy. He was a guy who was actually trying to better race relations, who was for Black Americans. But he owned a slave that his father-in-law gave him. He married into a slave-owning family. His father-in-law gave him a slave who Ulysses S. Grant later freed only a year or two later. And then when you see the burning of the flag that was wrapped around George Washington's head, so these protesters wrapped an American flag around George Washington's head and burned it before they toppled him. That doesn't really look like you're just upset about slave-owning Confederates or their attempt to maintain slavery. That looks like you just hate America. And it's starting to look like the right-wingers are right when they claim this isn't just stopping here. This is going to continue. And that has been the right's argument. Their argument has been, where does this end? You say it's just Confederate statues, but who's next? George Washington? And yeah, it kind of turned out George Washington was next. What's next? Mount Rushmore? Actually, there's a lot of protesters saying they would like to change the faces on Mount Rushmore, that they don't believe that it should exist anymore. So I wouldn't be surprised if Mount Rushmore is defaced. But the big question I have is, when you say that you want us to confront our racist legacy, what's interesting about that is that is fundamentally a authoritative right-wing Christian idea of this generational sin. It's this, you are responsible for the sins of your fathers. That is something that was taught in religious circles, where they would say God is condemning you because your forefathers, your ancestors committed this great sin, and so now you are a victim of the generational curse. In fact, the generational curse says, you shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. That was Exodus 25:6. Also Numbers 14:18, Deuteronomy 5:9. Look, that is a very right-wing, dogmatic Christian, and not even just Christian. I believe that other faiths that really adhere to the Old Testament, it might even be part of Islam and Judaism. I'm not 100% certain, but that is still a very dogmatic religious viewpoint to say you are responsible for what your forefathers, what your ancestors did. That is where I have a real problem with this whole we must confront our racist history. I don't know if anybody looks at George Washington and says, you know what, he was a founding father of this country. He was a wonderful man. And oh, by the way, he owned slaves and we still love him and he was wonderful and that wasn't so bad. Nobody thinks that. Nobody looks at George Washington and reveres him for owning slaves. Nobody looks at Ulysses S. Grant and reveres him for owning a slave. Nobody looks at any of these men and thinks, yeah, their genocide of Native Americans and their slave owning is what we are now propping up and glorifying. Nobody's thinking that. When people think of George Washington, they think of the founding of this nation. Now, that is kind of the crux of the problem with these radical extremists on the left, is they don't believe that the founding of this country should have existed. This is starting to look a little bit like a form of revolutionary war, where there is this rising sentiment that it's not just the South, it's not just the Jim Crow era, it's not just the slave owning past, but it's the entire founding of this country that's problematic. That is absolutely where they're headed with this narrative, that the founding of this country was founded on genocide, colonialism, imperialism, and therefore the country in and of itself is bad, even though none of us alive today were involved in that. Even though none of us alive today had a hand or a decision in any of that, but now we're being told that we are victims of a generational curse, that we have to pay for the sins of the founding fathers of this nation. Many of us aren't even from here. My family wasn't even around. My family came from Denmark in the early 1900s and Vietnam just 40 years ago. So many of us don't even have this in our genetic history. Our ancestors weren't here. And really any society that you look at, however, when you look around the world, you're going to see every society has a problematic history. There's not a single society on earth that doesn't have a problematic history. Even Scandinavia, it was founded by the Vikings. The Vikings were not known for being, peace-loving people. They were a bit brutal. So no nation on earth is exempt from this, and not even the Native Americans. And this is the thing that, I just don't know really where this is going with the toppling of all these statues. Again, I was on board with it when it was, okay, remove the treasonous traitors to the country who lost at war, and, they're still propping up that sort of like idea that they're going to secede from the country. I can understand that logically, but moving on to to the founding fathers, to former presidents, is, I think, for many people on the left, too far. That's something that the extreme left is doing. And many of us that are on the left are saying, okay, I think that any reasonable person, if you believe that we can be taught and educated, would say, yes, what George Washington did by leading us against the Brits and forming our own country was a good thing, because here we are, now we're our own nation. But, obviously some of the things that he did back in the 1700s are not okay to today's standards. But to hold these men and women up to the standards of today is really absurd. And in 100 years from now, people will look at you and they're going to say, you're problematic because you ate meat. And they'll say you slaughtered animals in order to do it. They'll say you put a collar on your dog's neck and walked him on a leash. And that's, in 100 years, I could absolutely see people saying, God, that was really barbaric to do that. So, in 100 years, neither you or I are going to be exempt from being judged by the generation that comes after us. But do we then say, okay, our great-great-grandchildren are going to be responsible for all the things I do today? And that is fundamentally not liberal, to say you are responsible for the problems that your forefathers, your ancestors brought forth. Now, if you want to address racism, and if you want to say, well, that's not really what we're doing, we understand you're not really responsible for George Washington owning a slave, even though you're an American and you're white and you're here. We're not really saying that. What we're saying is you need to own that racist past so that we can better ourselves. But we are way better today than we were back then. We don't have slavery today. We're not operating that way. And quite frankly, toppling a statue is not doing anything. It's a It's symbolism of toppling the government. It's symbolism of toppling America. It's an act of kind of showcasing a desire for revolution, right? To say, I'm not okay with this country. I'm not okay with its racist history. We need to start over. That is where this is leading. And it does show right wingers that, the left is kind of going in that direction where they just want to topple the country. I can't really say that there's no basis in that argument anymore when you're toppling statues of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Ulysses S. Grant, and Teddy Roosevelt, from the Natural History Museum. Now, I understand that that statue itself was problematic because when you look at it, it has certain depictions of Native Americans and African Americans. And, I understand people saying, well, we need to move that stuff. It doesn't belong outside, or, there's, I think certain statues we maybe could say that about, but when it's this blanket, now we got to get rid of Mount Rushmore and we got to topple Ulysses S. Grant, then the argument's kind of lost and it just becomes an attack against America. And does America have a problematic history to today's standards? Absolutely. But we've got bigger problems going on today. I sure wish the left would have this much energy, the energy they have to topple a statue. I wish they had this much energy about our current foreign policy. We are currently actually blowing children up in the Middle East. We are currently advocating for colonialism and imperialism and actively slaughtering people. And yet we're taking down statues from colonial period with presidents that hardly any of us are related to and none of us even pay that much attention to. And most of the statues, when you walk by them, people don't even know who they are. I mean, that's where this energy is going. So this line of thinking actually is actually a slippery slope because it's not directed. It isn't succinct and thought out. And because of it, it's going to have some serious ramifications for other people potentially around the world when not only does the United States go about wanting to remove monuments and statues from these time periods, but as that makes its way all around the world, could you imagine Italy? I mean, you'd have to destroy Italy. All of Rome. I mean, anything that the Roman Empire had Jewish slaves. They were conquering all around and enslaving people. You would have to get rid of everything the Romans built. You'd have to then get rid of everything Mussolini built. That's pretty much all of Italy right now. So you could pretty much kiss going to the Colosseum goodbye. All of the trips you were thinking of taking over to Italy, you could just say, no, I'm not going to do it because I'm not okay with their imperialistic past and their fascist past. I'm just not going to do it. I mean, I just not really sure where this is leading. And I think many of us are very confused by it. And it is only fueling the right wing when they claim that the left wants to take down the country. When you're wrapping George Washington's head in the American flag, lighting it on fire, then defacing him and toppling him over, it's hard to argue that that's not what you're doing. Something to think about. Coming up next, I do want you to watch the next video. I've got Hillary Clinton is planning on being the vice president of the United States. Kind of. Click on the link.